right, we're back. Thank you guys for coming back. Hey, Michelle and Sherry. How are you guys? Sorry, my phone's doing funky things. My phone is doing funky things. So they are back. They started, I was watching them behind the scenes a little bit. So we will get started straight out the gate. Make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you're popping in new or on the replay. Thank you very much. Did you guys have a good lunch? I had a good lunch. I did. All right, let's get back to this. Get more and more interested in this doctor's testimony.
Okay, we'll go back on the record. Doctor, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, are you ready to pick back up with your direct?
I am, thank you, Your Honor. And I think there was the parties had conferred about a demonstrative exhibit right before the break, and I think we've resolved that issue.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right. Dr. Hammers, before we broke for lunch, you were starting to talk about some of the hypotheses that you tested in this case. Before we get to that, I want to go back to one thing that we discussed earlier in your testimony, which is the groupings of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back, wounds A through F that we were discussing earlier. And I'm going to show you an exhibit that we looked at earlier, which shows the wounds and the measurements. Do you have that exhibit in front of you?
Not quite yet.
Okay, thank you. It's
This one?
it's the one with the measurements on it.
Oh, okay.
What's that?
I got you.
Do you have the phone in front of you?
I do
Dr.
now.
Hammers. Now, in your review of Dr. Cruz's materials from the autopsy, did she document the trajectory that these wounds took within Ms. Mullis's body?
She did.
And going through the wounds from A to F, can you tell us what those trajectories were?
Sure. So wound A was from the back of the body toward the front, from the right of the body to the left, and slightly downward.
What about wound B?
B was the same, right to left, forward and slightly downward.
What about C?
It was also the same, front to back, right to left and slightly downward.
And D?
And that was the same, front to back, or back to front, sorry, back to front, right to left and slightly downward.
What about E?
E was back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
And what about F?
Back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
Were you able to determine from Dr. Cruz's documentation the specific path that any of these wounds took through Ms. Mullis's chest?
So she did document like rib spaces that they went through, and the injuries with A and B, she documented specifically the organs that they struck.
Does documentation of the rib spaces help you determine with some specificity the path that certain wounds took through her chest?
Yes, it gives you either an ending point or a point along the way that you can tell if it's going slightly downward, upward, or sharply upward or downward.
Is there something with people's rib cages called an intercostal space?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, so you have 12 ribs, and in between your ribs, that's called the intercostal space. And so you have your first rib, and then your second rib, and your first intercostal space is between the first and second rib, and so on as you go down the rib cage.
And every person has 12 ribs?
Yes, in general, yes.
So for everyone, though, the numbering of those intercostal spaces is the same?
Correct, it's the same. It's always the space below it is the number of the rib above it.
And so for which of these wounds were you able to determine, because of the other things in Ms. Mullis's body that they passed through, what their more precise path was.
So A and B went through rib spaces, and E and F went through rib spaces. C and D only went into the soft tissue and muscle of the back.
I'm going to show you another demonstrative, which we conferred with the state about before the break. This is purely a demonstrative exhibit, Your Honor. It's not being offered into evidence. We've referred to it as demonstrative A. Do you see the demonstrative in front of you?
I do.
Would using demonstrative A assist you in describing your testimony, Dr. Hammers?
Yes.
What is depicted in demonstrative A?
So demonstrative A has the wounds A through F. It is a look at from the side of the body. So looking basically like from the right to the left side. So it's two-dimensional, but it has all the wounds A through F. It has their relative location on the body, and then the direction with an arrow that the pathway travels based off of the locations that Dr. Cruz had documented in her autopsy report.
And does figure A depict the trajectories and the relative depths of wounds A through F based on your understanding of Dr. Cruz's documentation?
Yes, it does.
Did any of this, the information that's depicted in the demonstrative in front of you, the trajectories, the relative depths, the directions of the wounds, did that assist you in your understanding of which wounds you consider to be grouped together in some way?
I would say yes.
And how?
So it allowed me to understand that A through D had a similar, essentially a similar pathway in the body, and that E and F had a very different and distinct pathway in the body. It also explained and confirmed my suspicion about wounds A and B being caused from the tines staying in the body and being much deeper than wound C, and also confirmed that wound D, where it did not come out of the clothing, it also only went into the body a very shallow depth.
Now, from what you told us before the break, it's your opinion that Ms. Mullis experienced wound D at a different time from A, B, and C. Is that right?
Well, different from, I guess, the grouping of A, B, and C, but what I've testified to is that from my review, A and B did not leave the body, so then C would have been at a different time than D, essentially.
And is your understanding of the trajectories of these wounds, is that inconsistent with your understanding of, is anything about the trajectories of these wounds inconsistent with your opinions about when and in what order Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds?
No.
All right. In thinking about the trajectories of these wounds, what were the trajectories of wounds A through F relative to Ms. Mullis's body?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think of and I understand that we're not talking in terms of the actual position that Ms. Mullis's body was in when she experienced these injuries, whether she's laying down or standing up. I'm not asking you about that, but treating her body as a vertical object, where were the wounds relative in terms of the trajectory? What was the trajectory relative to her body?
I'm still not 100% sure that I understand what you mean. Or, I don't know, are you asking about the anatomic position and how we measure them, or are you asking about something else?
I appreciate that question. If we treat the axis of the body as a vertical axis, how would you describe the trajectory of these wounds relative to that axis?
Oh, I think I understand now. Okay, so they're all going from the back of the body toward the front. They are all going from the right side of the body toward the left, and then A through D are going slightly downward, and E and F are so toward her feet essentially, but only very slightly. And then E and F are going up toward her head.
And those wounds A to C, when you say they're going slightly downward, are those near horizontal?
Very close to horizontal, yes.
Okay. Before we broke, I think we were starting to talk about your hypotheses in this case. And I think the hypothesis that you were discussing before we broke was the hypothesis that someone swung this corn rake into Miss Melissa's back. And I apologize because I don't remember. Did you tell us what your conclusion was about this hypothesis?
I honestly don't remember.
Well, what was your hypothesis? What was your hypothesis, or what was your conclusion about the hypothesis that Miss Mullis experienced these wounds in her back from someone swinging the corn rake into her back?
So my conclusion is that the pathway is not consistent with the features of the corn rake and the space within the shed to be able to cause this set of injuries in these pathways.
So leaving the position of the shed out of your analysis for a minute, were you able to determine, without knowing anything about the shed on the Mullis farm, whether this hypothesis was true or not?
The swinging
Yes.
hypothesis? Well, with swinging, that can't describe, if you sort of have swinging in any sort of way, shape, or form, it can't describe the entire set of injuries that have occurred.
Why not?
Because there's 4 tines to the rake, there's 6 injuries plus the scrape to her back, and they are in different directions.
Is it possible or were you able to disprove the hypothesis that someone caused these injuries in Miss Mullis's back by someone swinging the rake into her back more than once?
I was.
And what's your determination about that hypothesis?
That is not true because the clothing does not support that.
How does the clothing not support that?
So the outer coat of the clothing has even fewer holes than what we saw on the inner clothing, indicating that at least some of the tines of the rake did not exit the clothing in total at all.
Now, is it your testimony that the physical characteristics of the shed on the Mullis property contributed to your determination that someone could not have swung this rake into Miss Mullis's back to cause these injuries?
Yes, that's part of it.
And you said that you visited the shed on the property, is that right?
I did.
What was it about the shed on the
Morgana! Hey, ma'am. Morgana, ma'am. Everybody in the chat in the previous stream was asking about you, left, right, and center, ma'am. She says, hey, y'all, I'm home. It looks like I've been attacked by a corn rake. Get out of here. I'm so glad you're home. I'm so glad you're home. I hope they have you on some good medicine. Good medicine. Sorry. I know it's bad medicine, but you know. Anyway. Look, Michelle's got a Pepsi for you, dear. Oh. Margaret says, Morgana. You're welcome. You're welcome. Kel says, Morgana banana hammock. So happy you're doing good. Sherry's coming in with the hearts. Yeah, that was the first words out of Sherry's mouth this morning. In the first stream today. Like, I think Sherry was one of the very first commenters, and her first comment was, any word for Morgana? So, yeah. You want a new drug. Gosh. Hey, Rise of Phoenix. Good to see you. Margaret got the hearts, and Rise of Phoenix has the hearts. Michelle says, we've missed you today. Yes, we have. We have. All right. Well, I hope that you get plenty of rest, and I hope that family of yours that you're always constantly doing for does for you for the next few days anyway. So, we'll see. We will see. Morgana Banana. Aw. Well, we missed you. Yeah, Michelle, right? Yeah, rest up. Let them pamper you. Right. All right. We'll get back to it, but you just rest up. No moderating for you. You just close your eyes and listen. Gail Pierce just popped into the chat. She says, been lurking, Morgana. Hearts. Hearts. Oh, are you recouping in QB's room, are you? Oh, today's a nice day for it. The weather is nice. While we were on our lunch break, I sat outside for a little bit today. Pulled my pant legs up and propped my feet up in another patio chair and let the sun hit me. Ah, it felt good. It felt so good. Okay. All right. I'm going to get back started to this. I'm interested to see more what this woman has to say. I'm just saying. This woman seems to think that her injuries are not from someone swinging a corn rake at her. And she says that the shed also where the incident occurred, that there wasn't enough space for that, for all of the injuries to it. I don't know, but anyway, here we go.
Property that contributed to your opinions.
And look at, so this is the dad. I'm assuming back here in the back where my mouse is hovering, the guy with the gold watch with his arms crossed, I think that is the defendant's dad, Todd Mullis' dad. And then over here on the farther side, the other guy with his arms crossed, I believe is the dad's dad. I believe this guy is maybe Todd Mullis' grandfather. Either way, they look like twinsies in their blue flannel shirts and their arms crossed. That's kind of cute. It's kind of cute.
This is not possible.
So the openings in the shed are very narrow and leave little room to either side in order to swing a rake. And that would mean swinging from overhead would be necessary, and that does not add up with the direction of the wounds and the number of the wounds.
I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked. I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked as 731. Do you recognize what is depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What is it?
This is one of the walkways in the shed.
Does Exhibit 731 truly and accurately depict the interior of the Mullis shed at the time that you visited it?
To the best of my recollection, yes, it does.
All right, we'll seek to admit Exhibit 731, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection.
731 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have any understanding of where in this shed Ms. Mullis might have, let me ask you a better question. The hypotheses that you were considering about Ms. Mullis having someone swing the rake into her back in this shed, what areas of the shed did you consider in that hypothesis?
So basically the only open areas of the shed where you could walk, which were all very narrow within the shed. And then there was an area in the shed where it was reported that she was going to get a carrier. And that was in an area in one of those narrow walkways.
From your review of photographs and descriptions of this shed and from your own visit to the shed, did you determine any area inside of the shed that would allow for the hypothesis that someone swung a corn rake into Ms. Mullis's back in that area of the shed?
I did not.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received wounds A through F from someone pushing the corn rake into her back?
I did consider that, yes.
And what was your conclusion about that hypothesis?
So my conclusion was, from my experience and training, I've not seen any kind of injuries like that with having multiple tines of any type of object able to push into somebody, and comparing that to other cases that I have which have not been from a corn rake but from different weapons, that not being ever reported to me, ever seen by me, or anything that I've witnessed any of my colleagues having, where someone has been able to push an object like that through somebody's clothes and into their body one time, let alone multiple times.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received these injuries by falling onto this corn rake one or more times?
Yes.
And what did you determine about that hypothesis?
So from considering that hypothesis, based off of all of the information that I reviewed, that was the most likely and reasonable hypothesis, given the location, the distribution of the injuries, the features of the injuries, the features of the corn rake, and my experience and training.
Oh, you guys, I wonder if we're going to get like a Mythbusters thing like I was talking about earlier in the first stream. Because they do, during the break, I did see them bring out bags, big paper bags, like evidence bags. Maybe she's going to show us how she thinks it happened, or could have happened, or would have been a working scenario for how it would have happened accidentally. Also, now I want potato cakes from Arby's. Yeah. It's been too long since I've had those. They sound good, though.
We agree that if Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries by falling, she had to have fallen on this corn rake more than once. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Why does the hypothesis that she fell on this corn rake fit with the evidence as you understand it?
So the fact that it appears that she received wounds A, B, and C clustered together, and that wound D is in a similar area to C but is much more shallow, and there's movement of wounds A and B, and all of those injuries are in a similar distribution. I would expect that there could be more shallow injuries from her falling, even potentially from different heights or different distances above the ground. And then the change in that orientation with wounds, tines A and B staying inside those wounds, and then her sustaining the other two injuries. So to me, when I look at all the features of the wounds consistent with coming from the same object, and then the similarities in their orientation, that to me is the most likely and reasonable scenario for how those injuries occurred. And it fits with the differences of the features that I saw inside and outside of the body with wounds A and B.
Did you get any information from Ms. Mullis's medical history about prescription medications that she was taking around the time of her death?
Yes.
From the medical records, what were you able to determine about that?
So she had 5 medications that were listed as her current medications. 3 of them were medications that can sort of have a similar effect on the body, and in my training and experience were the more significant of the 3 medications that she was on that were listed in her medical record. 2 of them appeared to be medication she was on typically, and then 1 of them was a medication she was given post-operatively after her procedure.
And what would have been the consequences of those medications?
So those medications all can have similar effects of dizziness, somnolence, meaning sleepiness, and kind of like, those are like the 2 main, dizziness and tiredness.
Did the toxicology report that accompanied the autopsy in this case reveal those medications?
Can you ask me that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Did the toxicology report that was conducted as part of Dr. Cruz's autopsy in this case, did it reveal those medications?
It did not.
And is there a reason why?
So the toxicology panel that was tested for does not include those medications in what is tested for. So you have to have a panel of medications that you're testing for, and you're only going to potentially get positive results from the medications that are being looked for.
What is the generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology with respect to autopsies for seeking more than a basic toxicology panel in a case?
So the recommendation from the National Association of Medical Examiners is that you know the medication somebody is potentially taking, weigh them in your evaluation, and order testing that is appropriate for the information that you have.
And in this situation, given the information that was available with respect to the autopsy, was this a situation that where a generally accepted practice would be to seek more than a basic panel for the toxicology testing?
So in my training and experience, yes, this panel is, in my experience, and using this same lab, so I'm familiar with the panel, is a limited panel and misses medications that a very high number of the population actually take routinely. So it's really looking for substances of abuse or medications that are commonly abused.
You talked earlier before the break and in your testimony just now about seeking contextual information as part of your determinations, seeking information about medical history and the area where someone's injuries might have occurred, and looking at investigative records. Is there any concern for you as a forensic pathologist that that contextual information could bias you in some way to information that you're seeing at autopsy?
I would say no. Our job and the recommendation of all of our national organizations is that the job of the forensic pathologist is to be trained and have experience to weigh all of those items and balance out what is in them with what we have at autopsy, and to ultimately make a decision about cause and manner of death. So that's the whole reason that we're trained, is to gather that information, assess it, and form opinions.
Do you need that contextual information in certain cases to reach your determinations?
I would say that we need it in the vast majority of cases, but certainly cases that are more complicated, but we never know sort of how a case is going to turn out and the complexities that will come with it. So best practices are to have the information that's available through the steps that we described, if it's available and accessible.
Did you reach an opinion in this case, Dr. Hammers, about how you would classify the manner of Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
And what is your conclusion after consideration of all of the background evidence and the evaluation of the hypotheses that you considered in this case?
My opinion is that the manner of death is best classified as an accident.
Why is that?
All of the information that that I had available to me to review, it fits with the injuries that were seen. It makes logical sense. There was, witness statements, there was medical information that all came together to add up to what was seen on the body. So there wasn't anything about the injuries and how Ms. Mullis was described as being found or the implement that was found in her, the way it was reported, the way her body was reported, that made this inconsistent with anything but an accident. I'm sorry, consistent with anything but an accident. I apologize.
For a forensic pathologist to determine that the manner of death in a case is a homicide, what is the generally accepted practice in forensic pathology about the level of proof that a forensic pathologist needs to have to make that determination?
So typically, we use to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, but another way to say that would be that it's far more likely than not. So it's not just 51% that this is a homicide. It's that all of the information that you have far outweighs this being a homicide than anything else.
Is your determination that that the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was an accident, is that dependent on an understanding that her death must have occurred in the shed?
I would say no. It's not dependent on that, although I haven't seen any information that indicates that this occurred at any other location.
Is there a process as a medical examiner for a medical examiner to reconsider the official cause of death that they identified in a death certificate or in other documentation about a case?
Yes.
What is that process?
So it's, there's no sort of formal name for it, but basically any case that you have, someone can always come and ask you to reconsider it. The death certificate is always subject to being able to be changed with new information that changes your cause or manner of death. And so anytime somebody poses new information, you can take that information, review the case in light of that new information, and then decide if you will or will not change the death certificate.
Are there any situations in your career where someone has come to you with new information about a case where you've made an official determination about cause or manner of death?
Yes, there have been.
And under generally accepted practices in forensic pathology, what should the response of a forensic pathologist be in that situation?
Well, in every case that I've had or other people have had where I've worked, the information that comes is taken seriously. It's reviewed. Typically, it's reviewed with someone who is a superior to you. So I would review it, then I would sit down with my boss and discuss it, and we would come to an understanding of, what that how that material that was new weighed into what we already had, and if that changed the ultimate opinions or not.
Are you familiar with a concept called implicit bias?
Yes.
What is that?
I'm going to object. It's outside the scope of this witness's knowledge.
I agree. Sustained.
Do you understand, are you familiar with a field of science called biomechanical engineering?
Yes.
And in general terms, what's your understanding of what that field is?
Again, I'm not same objection.
You're,
Did you want to respond?
I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt the court. This is in Dr. Hammers' report that she considered this field and that she consulted with an expert in this field in reaching her opinions. I don't intend to go into the details of this field, that's not my purpose, but just to, that's the purpose for these questions, Your Honor.
I believe they have a biomechanical expert that is the next witness. I don't know why we have to rehash this. It's outside our scope.
Very, very, let's keep it very, very limited.
Understood, Your Honor.
Very limited. And again, I'll read the report. This isn't a jury trial. Let's try to move this along, please, Ms. Thompson.
Understood,
Okay.
Your Honor. Let me ask you this question, Dr. Hammers. Do forensic scientists consult in some cases with biomechanical experts in reaching their opinions?
Yes.
Is that a generally accepted practice in your field?
Yes, it is.
Did you consult with a biomechanical expert in considering your opinions in this case?
I certainly read their report, but I had my own opinions separate from what the biomechanical expert had to say. It happened that their opinion supported what I already believed to be the case, which was this was an accident. But my opinions and my conclusions were made outside of that.
The opinions that you've offered in your testimony here today, are any of those opinions based on new developments in the field of forensic pathology since 2019?
No.
Are these opinions that you could have offered in 2019?
Yes.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Is the report that you referenced reading in the field of biomechanical engineering, in this case, a report from someone named Dr. Susan Boley?
Yes.
And did you consider the information in Dr. Boley's opinion, the report that you read in reaching your opinions in this case?
I did consider it, yes.
Your Honor, on that basis, we are seeking to admit Dr. Boley's report in this case, and I think that we could take up the issue of its admissibility at another time, but we are, at this point, making a proffer that we'd seek to admit it based on this testimony.
And for the reasons we've already stated early on in testimony earlier this morning, we will have the same objection to that based upon the same cases that I cited.
Okay, sure. And we'll save that argument for another time so we can keep moving forward.
I have no other questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Dr. Hammers, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You agree the wounds that caused Amy Mullis's death, as they've been described by Kelly Cruz, you agree with that, correct?
That the set of puncture wounds caused her death?
Right.
Yes, that's
Right.
correct.
And there are other injuries to her body that were observed at autopsy, these blunt force injuries that you've described?
Yes, there were blunt force injuries, correct.
So you agree with Cruz on what she calls them sharp force injuries, you call them something else, but this the stab wounds that caused her death, correct?
I wouldn't call them stab wounds, but the penetrating wounds, yes.
So the penetrating wounds, as observed at autopsy, you agree with Dr. Cruz that those caused Amy Mullis's death, correct?
They caused her death, correct.
Right. And the number of injuries Kelly Cruz counted correctly, would that be true?
A through F, yes.
Okay. And you agree that A through F were the injuries that were observed at autopsy?
Correct.
You don't have any contrary information or anything that you observed from the autopsy of Kelly Cruz that would contradict that, correct?
In regard to the number of injuries, if we're just talking to the ones on her back, yes, I agree with
Correct,
that.
that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You agree with Cruz on the orientation of the injuries on the back, correct?
Yes.
You don't have any dispute with the measurements that she made with regard to the distance between the injuries, correct?
Correct. I'm not disagreeing with her measurements.
Or the depth of the injuries?
I'm not disagreeing with her depth measurements.
4 of the injuries, A through D, were downward, and the other 2, E and F, were upward?
Correct.
And I think I asked you this already about all the blunt force injuries. You agree those were all documented correctly. Is that right?
As far as, I would say, the location and the general description,
And the photographs that you were able to observe.
yes.
I think the only thing you really, maybe were critical of Dr. Cruz on was that she should have taken more photos of the internal injuries. Is that true?
I mean, if we're just talking about the autopsy process, I would say, yes, she could have taken more internal photographs.
So what it really boils down to is your disagreement with Dr. Cruz is that she ruled this a homicide and you would have ruled it an accident, right? Isn't that what this really comes down to?
I mean, I would say that's the final statement, but I think there's other things in between that I don't agree with the way that she's described them or testified to them.
You may have done the autopsy differently, correct? You may have done different things if you would have done the autopsy to Amy Mullis.
True, maybe.
And that differs from pathologist to pathologist, isn't that true?
I mean, yes, there's going to be some variation.
I mean, the core of what you do is basically the same, but there may be some variations there, correct?
True.
All right. Now, I know that you discussed these hypotheses here, but swinging the rake could cause the injuries that we see on her back, correct?
I don't know that they could, actually.
Not at all? Can completely exclude it?
I believe that I testified that I did exclude that as a possibility.
Okay. You could push the rake into Amy Mullis's back, correct?
I believe I disagreed with that as well.
Okay. So an attacker, let's assume there's an attacker, okay, that's not an accident. They could take the rake and use it as a weapon and push it into Amy Mullis's back, right? They could do that.
I believe I just testified just a little while ago that I've never seen that, I've never read that, and I've never read any report of somebody pushing a corn rake into somebody's back.
I'm not sure there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Your objection is?
I apologize, I'm not trying to get animated, Your Honor, but that really assumes, obviously, the exact issue that we're here to talk about, whether there's another murder with a corn rake. Because the issue here is whether this was a murder, Your Honor, that's why we're here.
Okay, well. Kelly, can you read me the question again?
I'm not sure that there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Mr. Brown, I guess, maybe can you just ask a new question?
So I will. So I think we both can agree that the death by corn rake is something unique. Would that be true?
I would say it's unique in the specific implement, but there certainly have been cases of people dying with other farming type of implements that are in the category of a rake.
Or other instruments that are sharp enough to penetrate the body, correct?
Yes.
You see that all the time.
I wouldn't say all the time, but we see it
But like a knife wound.
enough.
Right? Like
Right,
some-
but this is very different than a knife
I
wound.
understand, but it's something that penetrates the body that causes death. You have seen that before.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
We can both agree that the corn rake, specifically as an implement to do that, is unique. True?
Yes, that's true.
There are 6 injuries to the back of Amy Mullis that are penetrating injuries, correct?
Yes.
4 tines on the corn rake.
Yes,
That means it penetrated her body more than 1 time, correct?
yes.
All right. There has been a suggestion by Dr. Cruz that it was 2, very likely 3 times, and I assume you would agree with that.
The only thing that I would say is I think there had to be more than one episode of her being penetrated, but that doesn't imply that it was like that there was no contact with the body or no tines in the body when those additional penetrations occurred.
All right, so there's 4 tines on the corn rake, correct?
Yes,
We have 4 wounds that are in the same orientation in that you're nodding, so you agree with me, correct?
No.
No?
they're in the same direction, but they do
Okay.
not have the same orientation on the surface of the
Okay,
skin.
my apologies. But they're in the same direction, correct? And there are 4 of those, A, B, C, and D?
The path through the body is the same, yes, or similar.
And then there are 2 others that you have identified that would have happened at a different time, correct?
I don't know that I would say a different time,
How
but
would you say it? How did you say it?
they're traveling in a different direction, so they likely happened together, but I wouldn't specify the time.
So you've classified this as an accident in your opinion, correct?
Yes,
So that means that the corn rake would have to be in a position where Amy Mullis could fall on it, correct?
correct.
So it would have to be laying presumably on the ground, right?
I don't know that I would draw that conclusion because I'm not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't speak to the exact forces, but she would have to have enough acceleration of her body to generate enough force for that to pierce her clothing and her body.
Putting the rake on the ground, that would probably be the place furthest away from her where enough force could be generated to cause the injuries that you see, correct?
So again, I think it's very plausible that the rake could be on the ground, but I can't speak to the specific forces that it would take because I haven't done those calculations and don't have that expertise.
She would have to lose consciousness or strength, right, in order to fall. Would that be right?
She would have to do what?
She'd have to like pass out,
In order to fall?
correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like alarmed, I'm sorry. No, I mean, you can trip and fall, you could step on equipment and fall. Like, I don't think that consciousness is inferred from her falling.
But it would have to be with enough force that the tines of the rake could penetrate her body, correct?
Correct.
And that this happened multiple times, correct?
Some of the tines had to have penetrated her body more than one
So
time.
she fell on the rake more than once,
Correct.
fell on it more than twice, very likely, correct?
Based off of what I've described, I think it's likely that it is more than twice.
You provided some testimony as to the location of this incident, and I believe you called it, you correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of barn or outbuilding?
I think I called it a shed.
A shed, okay. So are you presuming that Amy Mullis was killed in the shed?
I'm not presuming that she was killed, number one, because I told you that my opinion is it's an accident. But number two, I haven't seen any information that suggests or indicates that this happened anywhere but in the shed.
Who provided the information that it would have happened in the shed?
Well, the information that I've reviewed has no information that this likely happened anywhere else. There's blood droplets
I'm
in the
asking you
shed.
who provided it. Who provided the information? Todd Mullis, right? He's the one that provided the information that she was in the shed? Isn't that right?
That is not what my opinion is. If I can complete my answer, then I can explain to you where I got the
Go ahead.
information from. Okay. So yes, there is statements from Mr. Mullis and his son about finding her in the shed, There are pictures from the deputies that went to the shed where there are blood droplets in the shed. There's no blood droplets anywhere else that are identified, and nobody, even the police reports that I read, indicated that they suspected that this happened anywhere else.
So Todd Mullis removed Amy Mullis from the scene, correct? You know that?
My understanding is that he and his son did.
And they would have put her in a car or vehicle, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Traveled for a distance,
That's my understanding, yes.
pulled over because he was told to do so by EMTs, is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So the ambulance and whoever was sent out to help her could meet on the roadside to assist, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So there's no 911 call that happens from the farm. You never reviewed that, correct?
My understanding is that it happened like on the way to the, toward the hospital.
Right, en route to the hospital, correct? Or
Correct.
en route to wherever he was taking her?
Correct.
To get back to the information that you're relying on that came from Todd Mullis, he provided information as to Amy Mullis being in the barn or the shed, correct?
So I just want to be clear. Are you saying that Mr. Mullis gave me materials to review?
No.
Is that what you're asking me?
Well, you told us that you reviewed the investigation in this case, right? And that he provided statements?
Okay, that's what I just want to be clear on. So what you're asking me is his statements to the police or to the hospital or to
Right,
first
or wherever
responders,
they
whoever.
were, whatever source.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So how would you answer that
I'm
question?
sorry, what are you asking me about
I
then?
said, the only person that provided information as to where Amy Mullis was located was Todd Mullis and possibly Tristan, correct? They're the only other two that were at the farm.
That's my understanding, yes.
So only those two people. So there's no independent confirmation of that by law enforcement or anybody else that you know of, correct?
As far as specifically finding her the way that they did, it was the two of them, correct?
And his description of Amy Mullis being in the barn with the rake in her back, that is his and his alone, correct?
I believe his,
Right. Okay. So Kel and Spins, right. So Spins is saying who falls on a rake more than once accidentally, right? That's what everybody thinks. And I would have thought the same thing. What, child? Yeah, you found her. As far, so this woman's testimony has been, I've really enjoyed her testimony, okay? Now, whether she's right or wrong, I have no idea, obviously. But earlier, I was thinking to myself, and I had mentioned in the chat, if somebody were to, let's say, accidentally fall on a rake more than once, how could that have happened? And in my mind, the way I saw it was, let's just say, for, example's sake, she fell backwards. Say she got twisted up, or say she did pass out. I don't know. But if she got up, well, but see, that's it, Rise of Phoenix. I don't know that she would have gotten up all the way. What I'm envisioning and what I think that she's trying to say is that she fell down on the rake and then maybe rolled over, got up on her knees, fell back again, and when she got, in my mind, when she rolls over to pull it out of her back, she, whether it's from up here or behind, underhanded, she gets part of it out, but not the whole rake. So maybe she's still got like 2 tines stuck in and falls back again. And then the tines that she did pull out re-stab her somewhere else in a different direction because of the way the directionality and formation and stuff. That's the only thing I can figure. Um, hold on. Kel says the only way I can picture it happening is if the rake was hanging on the wall. She backs into it, knocked it off the wall, and then fell on top of it. That's a good theory, too. Michelle says, could she have fell onto it front side first, then pulled herself out, yet falls again due to shock? I think that all of them went into the front side. Did any of them, were any of the injuries to the front or the back? I thought they were all on the back. I could be wrong. But, okay, I thought it was from behind. I did hear them say something about her left breast, but I don't know if that was like another, like injury that wasn't stab related. I'm not positive. But that's, I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible. Is it likely? Probably not. But she's saying that even if Morgana says, sorry, I passed out for a few. Love you too, Sherry. We were just talking about what to go get for supper. Oh, the breast was an exit wound? Because they said that the deepest one was only like however many inches. It wasn't. I don't know. I don't know. That would make sense because they weren't talking about around or under the armpit or something. So it could have been like from the. I don't know. I don't know. I guess they're trying to put in reasonable doubt, and I suppose it's possible, highly unlikely. Yeah. But I mean, them saying that they have evidence to prove that he didn't do it is way different than a little nibble of reasonable doubt, you know? Ooh, okay. Michelle said I heard them say she had a breast implant that was impaled. I completely missed that. So this is only really the third witness that they've had. Yesterday they had two witnesses. One was the 911 chick, or not 911, but paramedic. And then the other one was that ME that was on the stand all day. Today, this gal is the only one that's been on the stand and given testimony. And, but now I thought I heard them say that they have 40 some witnesses. I don't know. But right, I agree with you too, Michelle. I mean, it's, I could see it being a possibility, but there better be a whole lot more than that to let him get a new trial. I'll say that much. Also, though, one thing I was saying a while ago, before my child so rudely interrupted me, was what? Can you go see your dad for a minute? She's not in here all day, right? She comes in and out of here, and you know, and then her dad gets home, and that's when she wants to rip and roar. Go figure. So she was saying, this lady on the stand currently said that someone like swinging the corn rake into her back by way of someone murdering her, that her injuries weren't aligning with that. Whatever, I don't know exactly how she put it. I mean, I heard her talk about it, but she was saying that the injuries would have not looked like the way that they did. Mom. But what, child? Oh yeah, you got a big old. She's stolen my big white fluffy pillow, little pillow thief heifer. Get out of here, you little cow. She's a pillow cow. Ay, ay, ay. What made you weak just hearing me say it, Michelle? That made me weak just hearing you say it. What? Okay. Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead. I love you, little fluffy face. Now she's trying to be funny. Okay, let's go. I'm sorry.
His son also stated that?
Okay, those two, but nobody else?
That's my understanding, yes.
Did you factor into any of your opinions any information that Amy Mullis was unsteady on the day that she died?
I mean, I would say that I factored in the complaints that she had that were reported and the medications that she had and the complaints she had prior to her procedure and the fact that she had a procedure just about 4 days before that.
So what's the answer to that, that she was unsteady or that you had information that she was?
I'm saying I took all of that into consideration.
Okay. Todd Mullis also describes her that way, is that right?
I believe he described her as just coming back to helping on the farm that day because she had been staying, not working because of her procedure, and that she had complained about not feeling well in some way and was going back inside to rest.
Okay. So with regard to the amount of force that it would be needed to observe the injuries that you saw or that you also observed from Cruz's autopsy, you're claiming that those all came from an accidental fall, is that right?
Well, my determination is that the manner of death is an accident.
Maybe okay. So you were asked about pushing the rake into her back. Your testimony is that you've not seen those kinds of injuries before.
No, my testimony was that my training and experience has not identified situations where something with multiple objects on it have been able to be pushed in. That's what you were describing, right? Somebody standing and pushing into somebody's back multiple times into somebody's body at the same time.
You've seen the rake, correct?
I've seen pictures of it.
Or photos of it. You could take the rake, if you wanted to do it, and push it into somebody's back and stab them, right?
So what I said was, I do not, in my experience, you cannot do that with
I'm
multiple
asking
times
you
on a rake.
now about the rake itself that you've seen pictures of. You could take the rake and push it into somebody's back and use it as a weapon. Isn't that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. I think this was asked and answered.
Overruled.
In my experience and in my opinion, you cannot do that.
You can't do that, but you can fall on the rake. You can't push the rake into somebody. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm saying in my experience and my training, no, you can't. But again, I am not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't answer that
Well,
for you
you're-
with,
Oh, go ahead, I'll finish.
I cannot answer that for you with calculations, but I'm telling you from my training and experience, I've not seen that, and I have not read, I have not experienced that. And
Okay.
I do not believe that you could take multiple times and just push them into somebody intentionally.
But you can fall on the rake and that could happen.
Correct, because you're getting enough force to fall on the rake.
How about kick the rake into her back or stomp on it if they put the rake against her skin or put the rake against her back? That could happen?
So theoretically, that could happen. I can't answer about the forces on that, but I've also not been presented with any information that suggests that that's what happened.
Okay. Dr. Hammers, you indicated that you take into account the investigation, correct?
Yes,
That would include all information that's been provided to you.
yes.
I assume if you were missing some information or you thought you were, you would request that?
If I felt like there was something out there that would help me with my analysis, I would ask for it, yes.
And information that, particularly since Todd Mullis was the suspect here, statements from him would be potentially relevant to your determination. Isn't that true?
Are you asking the ones that I had or
No,
something?
I'm just asking you in general terms. I mean, statements that he would have made about what happened would be relevant to your determination.
They could be, yes.
His motive might be part of that.
Again, it could be.
If he had a reason to kill Amy Mullis, that would be something you would factor in.
It would be, and it would be something I would factor in. It would, I would take it with the other information.
I mean, if a defendant confesses to a shooting, you might call that a homicide or at least factor in a statement if they confessed to that type of crime. Is that right?
I would say I wouldn't necessarily call it a homicide just because of their statement. And if it didn't make sense that it could be a homicide from my autopsy, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody told me it was a homicide. I would use that as a piece of information with the rest of my examination.
And if a defendant would confess to a stabbing, that might contribute to your finding that it's a homicide. Is that correct?
Again, I wouldn't make that determination off of somebody's confession. I would make it off of the entire amount of information that I have. Again, if it didn't make sense that someone could stab that person based off of the circumstances and the set of injuries, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody was confessing to it.
And if Todd Mullis in this case made the statement that Amy was a cheating whore, or that she needed to,
I'm sorry, I apologize, Your Honor.
or that she needed to go to hell because she was a cheating whore, would you factor that in?
Objection, Your Honor.
This is evidence that was at the trial.
This is I guess the question is if. So with that understanding, I'll withdraw my question, or my objection, Your Honor.
Right. The witness may answer.
So again, I would take that into consideration as information that I would have.
Did you factor that in this case?
To my knowledge, I did not have that information.
Okay. Does that change your opinion
It
if you
does
made
not.
those statements?
It does not.
Yep, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Just a couple of questions, Your Honor. Wounds A through F are not stab wounds, in your opinion, is that right?
Correct.
And are your opinions in this case dependent on whether Ms. Mullis experienced the injuries that we're talking about in this case in the shed of the Mullis farm or somewhere else?
No, they're not dependent on her being in the shed.
Have you received any information that there's been any confession in this case by Todd Mullis?
I have not been given any information that indicates that Mr. Mullis stated that he intentionally harmed Amy. Mullis.
Is it your understanding there's any statement by Mr. Mullis that he intentionally or otherwise harmed her?
No, to my knowledge, I have not reviewed anything to that end.
You were asked some questions about the sort of the nature of your disagreement with Dr. Cruz and whether there's things you agree on and things you disagree on. Do you disagree with the sort of objective measurements and objective data that Dr. Cruz developed from the autopsy?
I do not.
Do you disagree with her interpretation of this autopsy?
I do.
Do you disagree with the cause and manner of death that Dr. Cruz ascribed to this autopsy? Or ascribed to Ms. Mullis's death, excuse me.
Yes, I do.
Do you, is your conclusion that this was an accident, does that necessarily exclude the possibility that this was a homicide?
I mean, in the realm of all things possible, anything is possible, but we are asked and tasked with the job of reviewing all of the information and making an opinion decision about the manner of death, and what is reasonable, what is likely, and what is most likely, and matches with all of the and is consistent with all of the information that we have available.
One moment, Your Honor.
Any recross?
Nothing else.
Thank you, doctor. You may step down.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Judge, while we're waiting on schedule, I have a 3:30 matter I need to take up, so I may need to leave. I think I mentioned this maybe yesterday. Even if we don't have a break, I may just get up and leave. Is that okay with you?
It's okay with me unless you would like us to.
No, the next witness is not mine, so I'm good. So I just don't want to delay things, please. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Ms. Thompson, did you want to start your next witness, or do you want to take a short break before we do that?
What's the first preference?
Kelly, what do you want to do? Keep going? Okay, right. We can get started, it sounds like.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. We call Dr. Valentina Nye, Your Honor.
Dr. Nye, you can take your time, come forward and have a seat in the chair to my left, please.
Okay, so I just want to say I really liked that witness. Okay, I really liked that witness, and I think that her version of what happened, I ain't mad at it. Excuse me. If we're gonna lean towards accidental, like I said, I have not seen the original trial. I really want to watch it. So I'm pretty non-biased at this moment, you know, not really leaning one way or the other. But she made some, I think, really good, some really good points. No pun intended there. Points, get it? Tines. God, I'm so sorry. That was so uncool. Anyway. What would your responses have been, Morgana? I saw your comment, Morgana. She says, oh, by the way, Jenny, I did ask the doctor if he had a good night's sleep. He said he did, but he wondered what I would have said if he said he had a horrible night. Yeah, what would your response have been? I told him we maybe would have had to rethink this whole thing. Oh, gosh. All right. So I will say though, however, if that is all that they have to offer, they got several witnesses left to go, apparently. I don't know. But if they stopped right now and that was all they had to offer was what this doctor said, I don't think it would be enough to make me give him a new trial. I'm just saying. So, let's continue.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please raise your right hand. You swear the testimony you're about to give will be true and correct.
I do.
All right, we're going to have a seat. You could turn that microphone on in front of you there once you're seated.
Pretty hair.
Whenever you're ready, Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Nye.
Good afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, I am Valentina Nye, VALENTINANGAI.
Dr. Nye, were you retained by Mr. Mullis's counsel to provide opinions in this case?
No, the firm I work for was retained and I was assigned to the case.
Thank you, and we'll get into that in a minute. Can you tell the court what your profession is?
Yes, I am a biomedical engineer.
Oh,
In
okay.
brief terms, what is a biomedical and biomechanical engineer?
So biomedical is the overarching heading that it's called, and essentially it is the application of scientific and engineering principles to biological systems to solve problems. And biomechanical engineering is a subset under biomedical engineering that specifically studies the response of biological tissues to applied forces and motions.
Nice.
Do
Let's
you
go.
hold any degrees in the field of biomedical or biomechanical engineering?
Yes, well, I have 3 engineering degrees.
What are those degrees?
I have an undergraduate in civil engineering. I have a master's in mechanical engineering, specializing in biomechanics, one of my specialties. And I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. Again, one of my specialties is biomechanical.
Super smart cookie.
You're not a medical doctor, Dr. Nye.
That is correct. I am not a medical doctor.
How is biomedical engineering different from being a medical doctor?
Medical doctors are
Right.
trained to diagnose and treat injuries. That is not what I do. I do not diagnose and treat. My job
At least she doesn't have red hair, glasses, nerdy, like the two. Didn't one or both of the Mythbuster dudes, I forget their names. We used to watch them all the time. Didn't they both have red hair? Or did one of them have red hair and the other one was bald? I can't remember. Anyway, she's going to be our Mythbuster.
job as an engineer is to consider the forces and motions and how the body responds to those forces and motions.
You mentioned it was your company that was retained by Mr. Mullis's counsel. Where is it that you currently work?
I work for Robson Forensic.
And what kind of company is that?
It's a consulting firm that employs multidisciplinary expertise, and we basically run investigations.
How is biomedical or biomechanical engineering used in the field of forensics?
Well, oftentimes I've been a forensic biomechanical engineer for almost 15 years. And my role is essentially if there is a person that has some sort of diagnosed injuries due to mechanical forces, it's my role oftentimes is to determine the mechanical cause of that injury, and how and if it relates to the subject event.
What does your work with Robson Forensics entail?
I run scientific investigations. So again, I'm one of the biomechanical engineers on staff. I'm a full-timer. I'm the head of the biomechanical engineering group. I'm the head of the medical device group, and I'm also the director of engineering there.
You said that that your company conducts investigations. Who do you conduct those investigations for?
It depends.
What kinds of clients does your company have?
Oftentimes, our clients are for litigation, but we are a neutral third-party firm, so we conduct investigations for both. If you're talking about civil, it's going to be plaintiff or defense, and for criminal, prosecution and defense. And we also do, non-litigation type investigations as well.
Is there a type of client that is, for the cases that you work on, is there one side or the other that your firm predominantly works for?
No, we're probably pretty even. I know for myself, I'm probably in civil cases 60%, 40% plaintiff defense, but my testimony is probably about equal, 50-50.
You've explained to us what biomedical engineering is. Is that a subspecialty within the more general field of engineering?
Yes, if you think about the classical disciplines, you have civil, mechanical, electrical. Biomedical is, again, one of those classifications under the overarching heading of engineering.
And is this a field that graduate students study specifically in school?
Oh, yes. Undergraduate, graduate, professors, industry, medical, biomechanical engineers are everywhere.
Are there biomechanical engineering university programs here in Iowa?
Yes, University of Iowa has a very renowned biomedical engineering program. Actually, the president of our firm is a graduate of that program.
Now, you talked about your degrees. What kinds of courses have you taken in the context of your study that has related specifically to the medical aspects of biomechanical engineering?
So I am the interface between engineering and the human body. Therefore, I have to understand not only engineering and physics concepts, I need to understand the anatomy of the human body. So I take the same anatomy courses as medical doctors do. Cadaver labs. I've held human body parts in my hands, not only for schooling, but for my actual work in my studies, part of my theses and contract work as a research scientist.
Are you familiar with the field of injury biomechanics?
Yes.
What is that?
So injuries are specifically defined in biomedical engineering as a failure of biological tissue. As an engineer, it's also my job to understand how tissues fail, so material science aspects. Because part of engineering is understanding and developing and designing using materials. Therefore, we have to understand how they fail.
Have you worked in your career on issues that involve injury biomechanics?
Absolutely, yes.
And can you give us some examples of situations that involve an investigation into injury biomechanics?
Well, just in my forensic career alone, aside from my research scientist years as in my graduate program and as well as consulting projects, in my career at Robson as a forensic engineer, as I said, oftentimes somebody's got some sort of claimed or diagnosed injury, and there's either competing scenarios of how it happened, or you find a body and there's injuries to it and somebody needs to know what happened to it. What kind of forces and motions did that body sustain, experience to get those injuries? That's where I come in.
Do you have research experience in the field of injury biomechanics also?
Yes.
And briefly, what has your research into that field entailed?
Well, a lot of my research had to do with, well, again, it's about the human body and how it functions, but also how to make it better, right? So when you're learning and part of the evaluation process for, say, joint prostheses, you have to understand how the tissues respond and how they failed in the first place, and how they will respond with the devices that we're developing.
Have you done research specifically on issues that have involved lower extremity biomechanics?
Yes.
Are there any differences in lower extremity biomechanics as opposed to other types of injury biomechanics?
So if you look at my CV, predominantly my publications are in, they're all engineering related. I have eyes, I have lower extremities, I have, hips, knees, but the fact is a human tissue, right? So human tissues being materials failure have a specific type of failure generation when it's applied to particular sets of loading. And even though you publish in one area, doesn't mean that that's the only area you work on. I've written a grant for spine research. I'm part of the Orthopedic Research Society, a member of the spine section, a member of the orthopedic implant group, as well as other memberships in other societies. And this is all in addition to my work as a forensic engineer for almost 15 years.
All right, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 285. And let me know when that's in front of you, Doctor.
Yes.
If you need us to scroll through this, let us know. But is Exhibit 285 a true and accurate copy of your CV and your reports in this case?
Well, I only see the first page.
Let me show you just a paper copy of that, if I could. Do you need this?
Thank you.
The top document in what's been handed to you should be a copy of Exhibit 285. And if you could just look at that and let me know if that's a true and accurate copy of your CV and your reports from this case. Have you finished looking at Exhibit 285?
Yes, just briefing over it. It appears to be, that is my current CV. It needs to be updated, but that's what I have right now.
What is not contained in the copy in your CV? What is not updated about your CV that's reflected in Exhibit 285?
I've been meaning to do it. I just haven't had time. I've had numerous guest lectures since then. I've had presentations to medical facilities. I present to medical facilities, to fellows, to surgeons, to medical staff. So I definitely know that I did a presentation for Grand Rounds and didactics for the Scripps La Jolla in San Diego. I've had multiple guest lectures, and I've also recently just ran a one-day workshop for a large sports manufacturing company talking about injury biomechanics.
Now, you mentioned that you work for this company, Robson Forensics. Is that your only current employment?
That's my full-time employment. I work at a gym for fun one day a week.
That sounds like a passion project, not something you do for money.
I mean, not for money, but I do get paid.
Is there anything else you're doing for employment currently?
No. That is, so it depends. Depends on guest lectures. Some facilities will pay me to do guest lectures. That sports manufacturing company paid me to conduct a one-day workshop. So do I have constant, but I have these employment opportunities.
Does your salary with Robson Forensics depend on the outcome of any of the cases that your company consults on?
No, regardless of the cases I have, the number of cases or the outcome, my salary stays the same.
All right. Do you work on any, or have you worked on any cases where ultimately after the work that you've performed, the client elects not to use your opinions?
Yes, that is not unusual.
Is that a concern for you or your company when that happens?
No, not at all, because we are third-party investigators. So whatever the science and the investigation yields, that's the findings. Whether it's, say, good or not favorable for the client that retained us, that is our answer.
Have you been qualified by courts in the field of biomechanical and biomedical engineering?
Yes, by federal as well as numerous state courts, yes.
Have you ever had a court determine you were not qualified as an expert?
Not that I know of, and that recently came up at a trial I was at, and they actually ran my name through all the databases that attorneys have access to, and in almost 15 years, they did not find one motion that was ever successful in disqualifying my qualifications or my opinions.
Your Honor, obviously I'm a pro hoc attorney here, so I'm less familiar with the Iowa procedures. This is the point where I would tender the witness as an expert, but I understand that's not the court's practice here. But I don't know if this is the point at which the court would offer a voir dire.
Any additional record that the state wishes to make at this point?
Your Honor, the state stands by its prior objections as it related to the use of specifically Dr. Nye's first report as it would qualify as vouching. I believe that that shouldn't be considered here. We do have a question as to what would be included in that binder. There's portions of it that are not appended to Exhibit 285, so I think now would be potentially an opportune time to take our afternoon break.
Okay, and I think at this point, we were just taking up the expert witness issue, and I was just asking if there was any additional record you wanted to make.
No additional record other than our prior rules. Obviously, as Mr. Brown noted earlier, we're not a Daubert state, so.
Yep, okay. And again, certainly, the court believes that the witness is qualified, so I don't think we have any problems there. I understand we might have some issues with regard to Exhibit 285, and it sounds like the state wants to clarify that. Why don't we go ahead and take about 15 minutes for our afternoon break at this point. Doctor, you may step down. We'll plan on picking back up hopefully about 2:45. Court is in recess until then.
Okay, I think we're going to be able to zoom, 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 and a boom, boom. Everybody shake your rumps. Okay. Now, I want to see the full, like, what is it they use to make those, like, in the Mythbusters, when they used to make, like, the human body molds? They made them out of, like, what was that? I don't remember what that was. Some sort of, like, gelatin or something. It wasn't gelatin. What was that? I can't remember. But that's what we need. I need that. I need them to do a full-on reenactment here. That's what I need. All right, that was a quick 15-minute break. Yeah, some kind of a plastic, like a silicone.
All right, we'll go
or
back in the
something.
record. Dr. Nye, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think before the break, we had, and during the break, we conferred with the state about Exhibit 285, and we are seeking to offer Exhibit 285 into evidence, which is Dr. Nye's CV and her report.
Any objections to 285?
Yes, based on hearsay grounds, Your Honor, and for the reasons stated earlier during our off-the-record discussion in chambers.
I will take those objections under advisement. We'll continue for purposes of this examination so that we can keep moving. Go ahead, Ms. Thompson.
And Your Honor, we have a binder of materials if the witness needs to reference them, which the state has looked at.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Knight, You were present in court for Dr. Cruz's and Dr. Hammers' testimony, is that right?
Yes, that's
And you've heard some testimony over the course of the last 2 days about the scientific method.
yes,
Is the scientific method a process that you apply in your work?
absolutely. Sorry, I heard about the description more so today from Dr. Hammer's testimony.
Now, earlier, well, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with something called a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
What is that?
It's a scientific investigation to often determine the mechanical cause of an injury and if and how it relates to a specific event.
Do you apply the scientific method when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't want to, without going into detail, can you just tell us briefly what the steps are that you follow when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Sure, yes. Just like all of us have taken in elementary school, if you remember back to your days of science, the scientific method is a foundational methodology to ensure that experiments and investigations are run so that they're repeatable and reliable. The first step is to have a hypothesis, a purpose. The next step is to develop a hypothesis or hypotheses. You can have more than one. The next step is to have materials and methods, right? So reviewing materials, gathering information, and then conducting necessary analyses to test those hypotheses. And based on the results of your analyses, then you can arrive at conclusions that then address the hypotheses that you set forth and specifically the purpose.
Dr. Nye, are you going to testify to opinions that you hold as to Mr. Mullis's case?
Yes,
And are the opinions that you're going to provide in this testimony opinions that you hold to a reasonable degree of biomechanical certainty?
yes.
How did you first become involved in Mr. Mullis's case?
I believe that one of the attorneys for Mr. Mullis contacted Robson Forensics.
And without discussing any conclusions that you reached, what was your initial, what was the initial purpose that you were, what was the initial work that you were asked to do in this case?
Sorry, I didn't finish. Once they contacted Robson Forensic, the inquiry came in, and then I was assigned to the case.
And, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to ask what you were assigned to do initially.
Okay, so so after that, we typically speak to the person that called us to determine whether or not I have the expertise that is necessary for their specific investigation. So in this case, my purpose was basically at that time to determine the mechanism of specific diagnosed injuries in Ms. Mullis.
Were you originally contacted to act as a peer reviewer for another biomechanical expert?
Initially, that's how it turned out.
All right. And did you issue a report at that stage of your involvement in this case?
Yes,
At some point, did your work in this case change?
yes.
And how did it change?
So initially, as a peer reviewer, I'm reviewing someone else's investigation to make sure that it is technically sound, following all the steps of the scientific method, and applying the engineering and scientific principles appropriately. I don't conduct the investigation myself. I'm just overseeing, essentially, the technical aspects. When that changed was when I was asked to conduct my own independent investigation.
Is the report that you originally provided peer review on a report for someone named Dr. Susan Bully?
Yes,
And Your Honor, based on the testimony, again, we'd seek to admit Dr. Bully's report, but we would ask to defer argument on that issue, Your Honor.
understood.
For your investigation, so not talking about the stage of this case where you were a peer reviewer, talking now about when your work in this case changed, did you conduct a biomechanical investigation with respect to Ms. Mullis's injuries in this case?
Yes,
And you described earlier your process of conducting a biomechanical investigation. Did you follow that process in your work in this case?
yes.
You told us step one is to identify a purpose. What was your purpose?
My purpose initially with reviewing some basic information was to determine whether the mechanism, or generally the forces necessary to cause Ms. Mullis's diagnosed injuries were generated due to a swinging stabbing event as was presented in the criminal trial transcripts that I reviewed, or whether it was due to a falling incident, which multiple records indicate, such as the 911 call.
Is a biomechanical investigation something that you can do on the spot?
No.
What does that process entail in terms of time?
Oh, it depends case to case. This is a very complicated case. It requires a lot of consideration and steps in reviewing case materials, the physical evidence, looking at 3D dimensional analyses, everything involved, the people, the diagnosed injuries, the implement, consideration of the spaces, the space involved, the mechanism of the injuries, scientific and medical literature review, calculations, applying scientific principles such as conservation of energy and laws of physics. It is a very arduous investigation sometimes.
I understood that from your description of your purpose that you were evaluating competing hypotheses in this case.
They weren't competing necessarily, they're just different.
But multiple
Yes.
possible hypotheses is what I meant.
Multiple proffered hypotheses, yes.
Understood. And I know that's step 2 of your process as you described. I want to come back to that, and I want to start with what case materials you reviewed in this case. You mentioned that you reviewed a report from Dr. Susan Boley, is that right?
Yes.
What else did you review in terms of case materials other than Dr. Boley's report?
When I conduct my own investigation, I have to review all the case materials myself. So that includes all incident information, specifically the police department documentation, photos, records, reports, interviews. As we established, I'm not a medical doctor, therefore I rely on the medical diagnoses set forth in the medical records. And of course, when I talk about all incident information, I'm referring to photos and documentation. So I'm looking at information that tells me what has happened in the incident because I wasn't there, and what the claims are.
Did you rely on medical materials from Dr. Kelly Cruz and Dr. Thompson in Region Medical Center?
Absolutely, yes.
Did you rely, or did you review any accounts from Tristan Mullis or Todd Mullis in conducting your investigation?
Sure, I reviewed, like I said, I reviewed the police documentation, and there are multiple interviews in there.
Right. Did you, in order to reach your determinations, assume that those accounts from Tristan Mullis and Todd Mullis were true or false? Or did you depend on a determination that those accounts were true or false?
No, I don't rely on that. That's why science is fundamentally based in science. It's based on physical evidence, application of physics and engineering principles, and not based on subjective accounts. Now, there's always competing witness testimony. I might do my analyses and go back and compare to what was said or stated, but I don't use that as the basis for a starting point.
Did you rely on any photos or documents from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office?
Yes.
What did you look at?
They had information regarding the shed, the rake, the clothing. They also had photos of Ms. Mullis's body, and they had, dimensions. They had dimensions of the shed as well.
Did you conduct your own inspection of Ms. Mullis's clothing?
Yes.
Meaning you yourself physically looked at it?
I myself physically looked at it, yes.
Right. Did you yourself physically look at the rake in this case?
Yes.
Did you yourself go to inspect the shed or any other buildings on the Mullis farm?
Yes, I went to visit the farm and the shed.
Did you rely on any opinions of Dr. Jennifer Hammers in reaching your conclusions?
Partly, again, a lot of her, again, the diagnosis of injuries, as we heard today, her and Dr. Cruz agree on the injury pattern.
Did you rely on any other opinions of any other experts in reaching your opinions?
No, not that I can think of, no.
All right, and you said that you relied on the injury pattern in this case from Dr. Cruz and from Dr. Hammers, is that right?
Yes,
And you've heard the testimony from both of those witnesses so far about what that injury pattern was?
the testimony as well as the autopsy report, yes.
Understood. And from the testimony from Dr. Jennifer Hammers today, was the testimony that she gave today about the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back, did that comport with your understanding of what that injury pattern was?
Yes, it comported with what Dr. Cruz reported in her autopsy report and prior testimony.
All right. Now, you heard Dr. Hammers give some testimony about other injuries to Ms. Mullis besides these 6 wounds, wounds A to F on her back, is that right?
Yes.
Did you consider evidence about any of those other injuries on her body in reaching your opinions?
Yes, I mean, I look at all the injuries that are diagnosed on a person. However, the information provided were there are already explanations for the other injuries, so I was asked to focus on the penetration wounds.
Are you offering any opinions one way or another about any injuries on Ms. Mullis's body besides wounds A to F?
I specifically was asked to focus on the penetration wounds, so that's where I spent my investigation time.
Okay. I'm going to show you, and there's been testimony about this, but so I want to briefly show you figure A, which we've talked about earlier in these proceedings. Do you have a figure in front of you?
I do.
All right. What do you understand figure A to represent?
Figure A is a profile view, so a side view of the, basically the human torso. It doesn't have a head, doesn't have legs, doesn't have arms, and what it demonstrates is wounds A to F, the penetration, relative penetration depth relative to each other, as well as the orientation. When I say orientation, I mean the trajectories through the body.
And I want to also show you, just for my colleague, A8208. I think we'll just call this demonstrative B for the record. It's A8208. We'll 208. And we'll just refer to this as demonstrative B. Is there another
Yes.
document in front of you? Did you hear testimony about this demonstrative earlier today?
Yes.
Does the information reflected on demonstrative B reflect your understanding of the measurements of the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes. Well, part of them, only injuries A to B, yes, A and
All right.
B.
All right, I'm also going to show you what I guess we'll call demonstrative C, which is A8207. Is that in front of you?
Yes,
And does this reflect your understanding of the measurements of wounds B through F?
basically the linear distances between each wound.
I'm also going to show you here what we're going to call demonstrative D.
I have a figure up.
All right. Does demonstrative D, third time's a charm, show you the measurements and the depths of wounds B through F?
It is a picture of the back, and it shows me B, C, D, E, and F. It shows me the relative depths of each wound, the linear distances between each of those wounds, and essentially the size of the wound.
And does that reflect your understanding of those aspects of the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes, based on Dr. Cruz's autopsy report. It also shows the abrasion above wound D.
All right, and we've had a lot of testimony about these wounds, so I want to ask you about what aspects of these injuries, I want to ask you about some specific aspects of these injuries. What characteristics of the wounds A through F that we've been talking about are important for your biomechanical analysis?
So we can start superficially, more on top of the skin. And as Dr. Hammers testified today, that we heard also reported in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, each of the wounds have a specific orientation on the wound. So A, B, and C are oriented 10 to 4 o'clock. D has an orientation that's different, about 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And E and F are oriented 11 to 5 o'clock. Additionally, the information about the wounds around each puncture, showing that A and B look more diffuse, as Dr. Hammers described today, and then and then the spacing between each wound. Now we go internally, then the trajectories are important to understand where they start and how they move through the body. Gives an indication about the path that they traveled, and understanding that A to D again has a trajectory that's through the body that's near horizontal to the long axis of the body, so perpendicular to the long axis of the body, though slightly downward, and E and F are
the injuries in Ms. Mullis's back, is that right?
yes.
Did anything about your investigation suggest that wasn't true?
No.
All right. You measured the corn rake when you looked at it?
Yes.
And what was it, what, if anything, did you note about this corn rake that was important for your analysis in this case?
It's important for me to understand the geometric, dimensional, and intrinsic properties of the rake. It has a specific shape, right? So if you stand the rake on its wooden handle on the very end, the tines themselves essentially point sideways. So not quite 90 degrees, a little bit lower than 90 degrees, so closer to the ground. And the spacing between the tines, there's 4 tines, as we've all heard, is a little less than 3 inches. The whole rake is about 37 inches long. It weighs about 2.6 pounds, and the center of mass of the rake is closer to the rake head. So it's basically top heavy. And it's metal. So the head of the rake is metal, the handle is wood, so it is essentially stiff, right? This rake, for me to understand, is a stiff implement relative to the human body. So if you're going to put the two together, it's the human body that's going to deform.
I want to show you as well Exhibit 938. Do you recognize what Exhibit 938 is, Dr. Nye?
Yes.
What is it?
It is a view from the top. So if I'm looking at the tines, and the tines like towards my face, I'm looking at the top of a tine, essentially.
Is the tine in that photograph for, I don't know the term you would use, but in a caliper or a measuring device of some
It is in a
kind?
caliper, yes.
And the tine is in the middle of that caliper?
Yes.
Does the Exhibit 938 truly and accurately depict a more close-up view of one of the tines of the rake at the time you observed it when you examined it?
Yes.
All right, and at this time, Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 938 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
938 is admitted.
As to this, I'm sorry. Specifically as to the tines of the corn rake, was there anything about the properties of the tines that was important to your analysis?
Yes, looking at the tips. Again, the spacing we talked about, the length, the shape, that it's stiff, but again, the tips themselves were very, they're not sharp, they're not pointy.
And why is the fact that in your view these are not sharp or pointy, why is that important to your analysis here?
Because as we discussed, it has a different mechanism of injury. And you know, they're kind of flat. and in a sense, just the way Dr. Hammers described today. If I were to compare them to something that people are experienced with, they're essentially kind of like a flathead screwdriver, if you think about it. And if you compare the cross-sectional area of the tip, which is in this picture, for a 1/4 inch wide flathead screwdriver, the tips essentially have a bigger surface area than the tip of a flathead screwdriver.
Why does that matter?
Because in the biomechanical studies, flathead screwdrivers are considered blunt instruments.
Is it, in your assessment, this is blunter than a flathead screwdriver?
This is blunter than a flathead screwdriver based on the measurements, yes. In addition, it's rusty, so it's not smooth, it's not new, so it's not perfectly machined, you know. So again, this is something that has wear and tear on it.
Why does that matter?
Again, wear and tear, just like knives, you know, you use them over time, they get more blunt.
Now, you said in your testimony that the mechanism of injury is different for this type of object. Different from what?
Well, different from sharp force, right? So if you talk about sharp force, tissues fail under compression. So this is basically a tensile loading. So you put something that's blunt against the skin or any kind of material, and you push through it, it basically generates a tensile loading, and it's the tensile loading that causes failure. And why that's important is because in literature, it provides information about the thresholds for human skin to fail under tensile loading.
You're using a lot of scientific terms there. So when you talk about the tensile loading that would cause human skin to fail, in layperson's terms, what does that concept mean?
Like ripping apart. You know, if you were to, you know, again, rip something apart rather than push it together, biological materials are anisotropic, and they have different characteristics and different failure mechanisms and different thresholds for failure depending on how you apply the force to it.
I want to talk more about how those concepts apply in this case, but I want to ask you first about your evaluation of Ms. Mullis's clothing. You had a chance to investigate inspect yourself Ms. Mullis's clothing, is that right?
Yes.
Did you evaluate the different layers of clothing that Ms. Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital in this case?
Yes.
And was there anything relevant to your analysis that you noted when you inspected her clothing?
Looking at the holes, again, this is information and evidence that needs to be considered. So the undershirt and the sweatshirt had the same number of holes as Dr. Heimer has described today, 5 of which were in the area of the 5 of the wounds. Remember, she has 6 wounds, and there was a cluster of holes in the sweatshirt and the undershirt that was consistent with being caused by a single tine. Additionally, the coat itself had the same area of the location of wounds except for wound D. So again, we have less holes in the clothing than there are in the body.
When you examined the jacket that Ms. Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital, how many holes did you see in that jacket?
In the area, in the location of the wounds, 5.
And when you examined the clothing, did you make any holes in it?
No.
Can you yourself account, well, let me ask you this. Did you hear testimony from Dr. Cruz that at autopsy they identified 4 holes in a photograph?
Yes, I know that photograph.
All right, and can you personally account for why there is a difference in the number of holes that you saw and the number of holes that were photographed at Dr. Cruz's autopsy?
All I can say is that the photos from the autopsy, that additional hole wasn't as prominent as when I went. When I went, that hole was prominent, and it matched up with the holes on the underclothes.
In general, why were you inspecting the clothing that Ms. Mullis was taken to the hospital in?
Again, it's all information. It's important to consider the physical evidence when running an investigation and making conclusions.
You've talked a second ago about the tensile strength needed to break human skin. In a biomechanical analysis that involves someone wearing clothing, is it important to understand characteristics of the clothing?
Yes, absolutely.
And why is that?
Because different clothing have different properties. Again, it's material science, right? So different materials will have different failure thresholds. And how it applies here is that Ms. Mullis was, as we've heard, was wearing multiple layers of clothes, one being a very thick, I guess it was described as a Carhartt jacket with fleece inside based on my inspection.
I want to go back and show you demonstrative D. In total, with your understanding of the wound pattern that Ms. Mullis had on her back, the rake that we've been talking about in her clothing, did you draw any conclusions about the mechanism of Ms. Mullis's injuries based on all of that data?
Yes, that it was tensile overload due to penetration from a blunt object.
And in layperson's terms, Dr. Knight, what does that mean?
It means that the skin was pushed apart by something that was not sharp, and when you push it against it, it kind of pulls the skin apart, and it fails under tension. Tension is pulling apart.
Did you hear Dr. Hammers' testimony about the pattern of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back with respect to the spacing of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes.
And did that give you an understanding of the mechanism by which Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
So again, the mechanism is the same. It's going to be tensile failure due to penetration by a blunt object. But biomechanically, when you look about the spacing between the wounds, and I understood that Dr. Hammers testified from a medical standpoint, I'm testifying from an engineering standpoint. Looking again at the materials, the geometry, the intrinsic properties of the rake, intrinsic properties of the rake being it's stiff, it's not malleable relative to the human body. It has essentially fixed spacing between the tines. I can then compare it to the wounds diagnosed on Ms. Mullis's body.
And did you conduct that comparison in this case?
Yes.
And what conclusions, if any, did you draw from that comparison?
Again, similar to the medical side that Dr. Hammers testified to, when you hyperextend, your skin on your back compresses, basically it squeezes together, and when an implement that's stiff like this punctures the skin, you then lay the body flat and flatten out the body, the wounds then are spaced apart. So the wounds are going to be farther apart than the spacing between the tines, which is what we have here.
And so did this biomechanical analysis that you did, coupled with the medical information that you had from Dr. Cruz's autopsy and the spacing information that you had, did that give you an understanding of the position of Ms. Mullis's back at the time that she experienced these injuries?
Yes, that she was slightly hyperextended.
Hyperextended how?
Arching or rotated.
And you're making a motion here, and when you say that she was she hyperextended on both sides?
No, I mean, the wounds are on the primarily middle, one is left, but right side. So she's twisting essentially to her right.
Is it your testimony that, because you've made a motion, I want the, I guess, record to reflect what motion you made. Is the motion that you made a motion that hyperextends your right shoulder back, bringing your elbows closer to your body?
Well, it's basically a slight twist and pulling my shoulders back, kind of like sticking out my chest a little bit.
And pulling your shoulders back, does that decrease the space between, does that decrease some of the spaces in your back when a person does that?
It just compresses the skin. It makes the skin squish together.
And would that dynamic of Ms. Mullis's back being hyperextended when she experienced these injuries, would that explain the spacing of the wounds on her back in the pictures that we've been looking at?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled, the witness can answer if she's able.
Yes, I think I've already testified to that the wounds, the spacing on the wounds are bigger than the spaces between the tines. So that means she has to be hyperextended, which compresses her skin together. So when you lay the body flat, the wounds now are spread farther apart in distance.
You heard some testimony from Dr. Hammers about how she would order the way in which Ms. Mullis received these injuries, the order in which they occurred.
Yes.
Do you, from a biomechanical perspective, do you reach the same result or a different result about the order in which these injuries occurred?
No, biomechanically, I agree that A, B, and C occur in pretty much at the same time. I think that based on the analysis, D happens next, and then E and F.
And why is that from a biomechanical perspective?
Based on the clustering, again, if you look at the injury diagnosis, you have the spacing between A, B, and C, and they're in a linear pattern. Additionally, you have the same orientation on the skin, so 10 to 4 o'clock, and you have the same trajectory through the body being horizontal to the long axis of the body. Now you have D, which is much smaller, less deep because it's only 2 inches deep and has a different orientation on the skin. And then you have E and F, which again are clustered together because they have an orientation of 11 to 5 o'clock and the same upward trajectory. Sorry, can I finish?
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
I had a pause there.
Sorry.
Additionally, considering the intrinsic properties of the rake being essentially fixed relative to the human body, it's not going to deform or be malleable. E and F are essentially in the middle of her, E, C, and D are essentially in the middle of her back. Those tines cannot be inserted into the body one at a time. It's kind of like if you look at the palm of your hand and you take a fork, you can't enter one prong through your entire palm without having the other 3 prongs contact you. It's similar here. We have a fixed distance between the tines. So E and F, if you're impacting the body with the rake, that a third tine has to happen somewhere, and we don't have another upward trajectory. So those ones can't happen first. Similarly with D, D is essentially close to the middle of the back. You cannot insert one tine at a time. So D is not going to happen first either. So that leaves A, B, and C.
And did you hear testimony from Dr. Hammers about the theory that there could have been tines that were that were inside wounds A and B, and then have tines go into other wounds while the tines in A and B remained in A and B?
Yes.
From a biomechanical perspective, do you have an opinion on whether that's possible?
Yes, that is what happened based on the analysis that I conducted.
All right, so at this point I think your testimony has been that you identified what the injury pattern was as you understood it. You looked at the rake, you looked at Ms. Mullis's clothing. Did you also look at the shed on the Mullis farm?
Yes.
And I want to just show you Exhibit 731.
It's up.
All right. Do you recognize what's depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What do you understand Exhibit 731 to depict?
It depicts a photo inside the shed where Dr. Hammers was describing one of the walking paths, one of the very few walking paths.
You said that you yourself visited the shed as well.
Yes.
Does Exhibit 731 look like the shed, the inside of the shed, or the area of the shed that's depicted in 731 when you saw it?
It looks like it.
Why did you go to the shed and look at the shed?
Again, it's information to gather, a data point that needs to be considered.
And why does it need to be considered?
Well, if I have all these essentially different hypotheses to test, I want to understand the space in which the people or claimed people involved how they fit relative to the spacing. So now we have to consider anthropometrics, the people claimed to be involved, now we know what the implement looks like and how long it is, and I have different hypotheses to test. So I want to know what space I'm working in. You know, am I working in a giant field or am I working in a box?
Was it was it an assumption that you had at the time you tested your hypotheses in this case that the interior of the shed on the Mullis farm was where Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
I don't assume.
I mean, did your opinions depend on the interior of the shed being where she experienced these injuries?
No, no. If I didn't have, now that I conducted my investigation, if I didn't have information about the shed, my opinions wouldn't change.
All right, so you talked about the scientific method. I think we've talked about your purpose. Have we talked about all of the case materials that you reviewed in this case and that you relied on to reach your opinions?
I believe so. The
All right.
physical evidence, yes.
Okay. And I think we skipped a step, which was developing hypotheses. And I want to use the right term that you use. I think you said that you considered different possible hypotheses. Is that right?
Well, I considered different hypotheses that were proffered in the material I reviewed.
All right. So you mentioned a moment ago that you had to take that when you conduct these kinds of biomechanical investigations, you take all of these case materials into account to conduct your assessments. And before we talk about any of the individual hypotheses that you considered in this case, how did you take all this information to test those hypotheses?
So part of the scientific process, after you've developed a purpose and your hypotheses, reviewed case materials, the next part, and we now talked about the mechanism necessary to cause these injuries. The next step is basically to apply engineering and scientific principles to determine whether or not that mechanism is generated in each hypothesis, if and how.
Just as an aside, the process that, well, not as an aside, I want to ask you this. The process that you're describing, is this the same thing as an accident investigation or an incident investigation?
Yes, incident investigation.
Okay. Is what you are doing when you determine whether different hypotheses are possible, is one of the things that you have to do to decide how much force would be necessary to cause whatever hypothesis or whatever hypothesized mechanism you're considering?
No, not all the time.
And why is that?
Because as I defined earlier, mechanism of injury is the type and direction of forces necessary to cause an injury. That excludes magnitude, right? So talked about it a little bit, but types of forces are compression, so pushing together, tensile loading, which is pulling apart, shear loading, which is essentially sliding or transverse to a plane, torsion. Along with those different types of loading, you can have combinations of all those loading. Now, direction is important because the human body and all objects in are three-dimensional. So knowing that each one of those types of forces, as well as any combination of those forces, can be applied to the body in every plane, in any increment of that plane. That's what mechanism of injury means. That's first and foremost. If the mechanism doesn't match, then I don't need to do magnitude. And I've testified before, the analogy is if I'm looking for a red dress in size 5 and I find a blue jumpsuit, I don't care how big it is or what size it is. It doesn't matter.
All right, so to test a particular hypothesis, you're first determining if the type and direction, if the mechanism is possible.
If the mechanism is generated first, yes.
Right, and if the mechanism is generated, do you then determine whether the magnitude of the force is possible?
Again, if it's necessary.
If you have to get there.
If I have to get there. It depends on the case.
Are there any other potential steps in your biomechanical analysis of trying to decide if a particular hypothesis can be proved or not?
Could you please repeat that?
Sure. So in testing a particular hypothesis, you determine if the mechanism fits?
If the mechanism is generated in the hypothesis provided, yes, that I've generated based on the materials.
Right, and you then determine if you need to, if the magnitude of the force could be generated.
If necessary. Again, I'm not going to say I always have to do that, because case by case, I don't need to do that.
Understood. Is there a third potential step? Or are those the two steps?
I don't know what you mean by third potential step.
All right, let's start talking. Let me go on and we'll come back to this issue. To do what you're just describing, to determine the mechanism of the injury, meaning the type and the direction of the injury, what do you have to analyze?
So I already discussed the mechanism necessary for Ms. Mullis's injuries are blunt penetrating forces, which are generated by the rake. We have that she's hyperextended, and we have the orientation the rake has to be in, because we know that the tines are flat. So it has to be somewhat entered when she's hyperextended and rotated. So that gives me a position and orientation of the rake on the surface relative to the injuries. Additionally, looking at the tines, how they are, again, fixed and almost perpendicular to the ground, just slightly downward, if you were to hold the rake up. If you match that up with her trajectories, I now have a position and orientation of how the rake fits into her wounds.
When you are conducting the type and direction analysis, are you considering the laws of physics?
Yes,
And are you considering biomechanical and engineering principles as well?
absolutely.
All right. I want to talk about the possible hypotheses that you considered in this case. Did you consider as a possible hypothesis in this case Dr. Cruz's determination that it was possible that the corn rake was swung into Ms. Mullis's body to cause these injuries?
Yes, and that was what was presented in the trial transcripts for the criminal trial, that it was swung multiple times into her body.
In your biomechanical investigation, were you able to prove or to disprove this hypothesis?
I was able to disprove that hypothesis.
And how did you disprove that hypothesis?
So again, sorry, I keep saying that, but so in every analysis, the engineering fundamentals include Newton's laws of physics, conservation of energy, and I don't know if you want me to go through the laws. I don't need to go through 1, 2, and 3 unless you want me to. But based on Newton's laws of physics and understanding the mechanism of the injury and how the rake is positioned, yes, and in considering the anthropometrics of the people involved, there is about 10.5-inch height difference between Mr. Mullis and Ms. Mullis. So that takes that into consideration.
I want to stop you there. When you talk about their anthropometrics, was that considering the height and weight of each person that would have been involved in this hypothesis?
Yes, and later on I use it further for Ms. Mullis.
Where did you get the height and weight information that you used in your analysis?
The medical records for Ms. Mullis provide me a height and weight, and I actually don't remember where I got Mr.
Your Honor,
Mullis.
I am going to object to the line of questioning as beyond the scope of the report in violation of the rules of civil procedure, as it does not include the study nor the actual evaluation of Ms. Mullis's weight or any of the matters in question here. In fact, I believe that Dr. Nye's report specifically, her second report at page 2, footnote 5 says she doesn't include the actual data and principles, and to date I don't believe we've received the specific data, principles, or force inert evaluations. I'm sorry, the force evaluations at issue for her testimony here. And so the state objects, says it's beyond the scope for purposes of the rules of civil procedure, and therefore falls outside the allowable scope of her expert testimony.
You wish to respond?
I thought that we conferred about this at the break, but we tendered Dr. Nye's biomechanical investigation materials to the state in discovery. I wasn't at the case at this point, so I'll let my colleague handle this, but these materials were disclosed.
They were disclosed last year, Your Honor, and supplemental discovery, I think it was May 27th or June 4th, 2024.
For clarification, Your Honor, is this what you're referencing?
Yes.
I don't know that this is actually, as we conferred in the hallway, I believe we conferred and confirmed that most of it was Dr. Bowley's figures and expressed information. That most of this, I believe, was either copy and pasted for the portions at issue. And again, it was labeled a work in progress and never made a part of the actual expert reports at issue. So based upon the actual calculations, I do believe that we do not and have never received, as Dr. Nye's footnote 5 notes, we have never received the actual information underlying the specific findings.
Judge, may I
If you want to respond, that's fine. Otherwise, we can take a quick break and go off the record so you can look further into what was actually exchanged back on that date.
The applicant and the state share a Dropbox link, and this was provided to them in the supplemental discovery, as I mentioned. There's actually 2 files, and it's not a copy and paste. It's actually Dr. Nye's work in progress of what she was doing and how she came to her analysis of, and I think it also includes like law enforcement and reports and basically her calculations and stuff.
Your Honor, I think this is this is actually, I don't think there's a dispute about what the state received. I think the dispute here seems to be about whether that's a sufficient disclosure. I think that's the issue. I don't think we dispute what was turned over.
Well, I guess I'm hearing a dispute about what was turned over, so.
And we do dispute what was turned over.
Sure.
Commissioner Vaught, you're the witness.
Sure.
Thank you. Dr. Nye, you've previously been deposed and testified in other cases, including at least 24 prior times, correct?
Yes.
Including deposition timeframes recently in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District, I believe, of Texas on an estate case. Is that fair? I believe it's called Ramirez v.
Yes.
Escobedo.
I know that case, yes.
And during that point in time, you also were questioned in your deposition about how you form the notes in question. Do you recall that? How do you take notes when evaluating the case record? Fair?
I don't recall that testimony specifically, and if you could just slow down a little bit, that would be very helpful.
Oh, no problem. I apologize. I believe how do you take notes and prepare the documentation?
So I typically start with a case summary file where I take basically screenshots from material I'm reviewing so I can keep track of where I got what information from. And then I generate an analysis file. And that's basically specific information from the materials I reviewed against, but more condensed. And then I go through an analysis.
And so for your case review file and the information here that would be provided, those photos, for instance, you didn't...
You have to slow down, please.
These photos specifically would be taken at different times, right?
Which photos do you mean?
For instance, what's labeled TRM demonstrating rake position.
So those are not photos. Those are screenshots from a video interview of
And
TRM.
you also included Dr. Hammer's letter, I believe, regarding Ms. Mullis and this case specifically, right?
Yes.
And
Excerpts of it, yes, excerpts of it.
The analysis and information that goes forward from there, those aren't your pictures or those your paragraphs, right?
So again, continuing on, I contain excerpts from Dr. Hammer's report. Those photos are from autopsy, I think, or from Dr. Thompson's photos. And then some inspection photos of the rake.
Including Dr. Bowley's reports, figures, numbers 19, 20, and 21, I believe.
I don't know what Dr. Bowley's figure 19, 20, and 21 are.
I believe they're included in the same section of the paragraph or supplemental discovery that we'd be discussing here. Would it be helpful to see? I believe it's in your binder as well.
Could you just reference the page? I just think.
They're not numbered, but
Yes, they are.
it's the
Oh, I see what you're saying.
fifth from
Yeah,
that.
yes.
Those aren't your figures, correct?
Those are not my figures, but I didn't need them.
Because like you said, you screenshotted the information and included it so you could refer to it later, right?
I screenshotted information. Again, it's the information for me to look back on, so I don't have to go to multiple documents.
And so this document, or your file for purposes of the analysis, is mostly reflected in footnote 5. Fair?
Well-
Where you didn't include your actual specific data, right?
So from my understanding, footnote 5 I put in there because I was going to be deposed. I had a deposition date for this case, and it was canceled. So I was willing to have my deposition where I could provide my details over a year ago, which I think the state canceled.
So you haven't included those details specifically?
No,
here in your
because I thought I was going to testify to them.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state submits its objection again. The information is not provided for her own evaluation and by their own, Dr. Nye's own admission, was left out for purposes of the deposition at hand. And so the state objects in violation of the rules of civil procedure.
However,
Okay,
my
hold
report
on,
itself.
hold on. Wait. I was told that the information was provided to you on May something through a Dropbox link. If you need a chance to check and see if you have it, I will provide you with that opportunity. But as of right now, the representation is being made that the materials were in fact provided. So that's where things stand. Whether or not they came directly from the doctor or not is irrelevant to me if you have them. So do you need a chance to check and see if you received them on that date?
We can certainly check and we can also confirm.
All right, let's go off the record. Let me know, please, when you've had a chance to do that.
Thank you.
Recess, thank you.
Yep.
Lordy D, they got to get their ducks in a row, man. Get your ducks in a row. I love, though, how that witness told him to, like, slow down twice. She's like, you have to slow down. So they're having a discussion here off mic. It was a rather loud vehicle that just drove past the house. A rather loud vehicular. I'm getting my water in. My water. Y'all getting your water? Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. I'm watching them. Wow. So the dude that was just talking, that one prosecutor, he gets on my nerves. I don't like him. Not even a little bit. I don't like him. All right. We're live, so we are in real time. I need to know from you guys in the chat. Is your mind changing at all? Or do you still think he did it? Tell me your thoughts. Are you seeing any validity to what this gal is saying? Or the other lady that was just on the stand earlier? About her injuries? Kayleen, right? I know. Michelle says he is hateful. Oh, we're talking about which one are you talking about, Michelle? You think he did it? Who do you think is hateful, the prosecutor or the defendant? How are you feeling, Kayleen? How are you feeling today? Here come the yawns. Da da da. Da 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 da. Da da da. Off topic completely. Dale and I were watching back some of the videos from the SNL 50th anniversary. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to knock my microphone over. Did y'all see Cher at the SNL? Oh my God, she looked phenomenal. The comb over dude. I wasn't going to say that, but yeah, he definitely has a comb over. I wasn't going to say anything, but yeah, he has a comb over. Kayleen says miserable watching the court distracts me, and that's good. That's good. Kayleen says, I can't see how you fall on a rake and it penetrates a Carhartt jacket. Those are super thick. I know. I know. I know. Dun, dun. Oh, Michelle, it's totally worth going back and watching on YouTube. Yeah. Totally worth going back. She looks so good. Oh my God. These yawns are horrible, man. She looked so good. And then I can't remember if that was on the same video or if he went to another one. Backstreet Boys was there. They did a really good job. But Cher was in one of her cute little skimpy, like leotard outfits as per the usual, you know, leather and black, and she just looked incredible. She looked absolutely incredible. And I mean, isn't she like 80 years old now? She is pure plastic. That's what my husband said. He said she should look good. She's all plastic. And I said, now wait a minute. How many people have you seen that are half her age and look way worse than she does? Whoever her doctor is, he's worth it. She's 78. Okay, there you go. So, what was it that she sang? Oh shoot, what song did she sing? I'm sorry, these yawns are getting the best of me. Um, she sang one of her classics. I can't remember which one it was, but she sounds good. And you could tell she wasn't lip syncing because um she would smile and you could hear it in her singing that she was smiling while she was singing, you know? And different things. But was it Turn Back Time? I think so. Maybe that sounds that maybe that was it, or probably that one. I just can't remember. But oh my god, it was so good. Her hair looked phenomenal. Ah, I love her. Turn back time is when she wears a black leotard. Okay, well, then that was probably it. Auto tune her? I don't know. It sounded pretty. It sounded good, but you can tell she's aging. You know what I mean? Why? These yawns, man, they try to unalive me every single day. God. I don't know. I just know it was so good. And you could see like all the different people out in the crowd, all the like SNL cast and like um all the different guests that's been on there time and time and time again. Um Adam Sandler, God. I almost said Jerry Lewis, not Jerry Lee Lewis. Lord, Jerry Seinfeld. God. Um, jeez, I don't even know. There was so many. It was so good. I know, Michelle. I'm sorry. I'm trying to not do it because I know that it's. I know that it's contagious. They're making my eyes water, and it's one right after the next. Oh, I missed Kayleen's comment. She said, just starting to lay drills down on my mystery kit number 63. This is tough. You saw Kevin Costner smiling at Cher on a clip. Have you guys ever watched, is it Mask? I always get confused if it's Mask or The Mask because one of them's Jim Carrey. But the other one has Cher in it with her son who has some sort of I don't know if you call it like Elephant Man syndrome or whatever. And oh my god, that was such a good movie. I cry every time I watch that. But Sam Elliott is in it. What is it we say about Sam Elliott, ladies, in the chat? What is it that we say about Sam Elliott? You've never seen it, Spins? Oh, it's so good. It's very sad, though. Very sad. But very good. Spins, ma'am. Are you okay? Are you okay? Mm-mm. Them be fighting words. Those would be fighting words. Morgana, what are you talking? Salmonella. Are you trying to make me say salmonella? Hmm. I'm so sleepy now. What is Michelle roaring about? Rawr. Is she roaring over Sam Elliott? Bum, bum. Sorry, I'm on another tab Googling. Ba-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Mm-mm-mm. This is Mask is a 1985 American biographical drama film directed by Peter Bogdanovich, starring Cher, Sam Elliott, and Eric Stoltz, with supporting roles played by Dennis Berkley, Laura Dern, Estelle Getty, and Richard Dysart. Cher received the 1985 Film Music Award for Best Actress, Film Festival Award for Best Actress. The film was based on the life and early death of Rocky, that's it. Roy Lee Rocky Dennis, a boy who had craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, an extremely rare genetic disorder known as Leonidas due to the disfiguring cranial enlargements that it causes. So good. Says Estelle Getty, who plays Sophia in The Golden Girls, plays as Evelyn Steinberg, Rusty's mother and Rocky's grandmother. Rusty is Cher, by the way, who tries to mediate the tension between her husband and her daughter. Such a good movie. Michelle said Morgana's high on painkillers. Oh, did you doze off, Sherry? Earlier? I was not talking about salmonella. I was talking about Sam Elliott. Nope, just ibuprofen and Tylenol. Should have asked for the better stuff, Morgana. Morgana said they gave me something stronger, but I haven't used it yet. Well, ma'am, you have it to use it. They say to stay ahead of Ma'am, you have a daughter who is a pharmacist. She needs to tell you to stay ahead of the pain. Wonder if they got their ducks in a row now. Michelle says, and now Hollywood people pay to look like lions. Right. Right. Stay ahead of the pain, ma'am, says Spins. And Sherry says, Morgana, don't wait on the pain meds. Right. If you wait on the pain meds, if you wait until you start hurting to take the pain medication that they gave you, the good stuff, then no. Take it like it says to take it, and then you'll stay on top of the pain. At least the first few days. Like, give yourself a few days of, a couple of days at least of doing that. And then after, you get over the worst of it, then you can start, taking it when you only need to. They told me not to take it unless I really needed it. Ma'am, you just had surgery. This is day 1. I think you probably really need it. Now, in 3 or 4 or 5 days, you may not really need it. Michelle, right, says it will hit and then you will not get it under control. They just don't want you to get hooked because they get sued. Use it. Oh, goodness. Well, if you're going to use it, I would start taking it before you go to bed. So that you can at least get a good night's sleep, hopefully, prayerfully. That camera's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That dude is too young to have a comb over, man. I'm just going to be mean right now. I'm not one that attacks people's looks, but I feel like saying, dude, you just need to cut that off. Like, shave your head. Get it over with. Just do it.
Thank you. Please be seated. Okay, Mr. Duden, were you able to identify if you had received the materials that were referenced in that footnote?
My belief, Your Honor, is that we have received the materials that have been disclosed and exchanged during discovery, so there's no dispute as to what we received. I think the dispute is to whether or not it's substantively enough for purposes of an expert evaluation or report, as they're required to include their data, impressions, and opinions. We're certainly willing to wait on our objection in order to talk about that evaluation, but what it sounded like when we left off, or at least my understanding, was that based upon a deposition that had never occurred, that information was going to be left out in order to be asked about. That information was going to be able to be requested at that deposition, but was not included within the report itself. So I think more so it's whether or not the data and impressions and opinions that would be included in the report are enough. And certainly, as our objections had been noted earlier, the answer was no. But we do not believe that there's any dispute as to what's been exchanged.
Okay.
So the state withdraws its objection for the purposes of continuing questioning and will raise the objection again should we go outside the scope of what was, believed to be included in the report itself.
Okay, we'll continue. Dr. Nye, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson.
Your Honor, I want to proceed. I just want to say that I'm not sure that reflects our position on this issue, but I agree we should move forward. But I'd rather take this up at another time.
Okay.
Understanding I don't accept that representation, I agree that we should proceed.
All right, we will. And I will just question you. I know we did go a little bit late yesterday in order to finish with the witness. I have no idea what Dr. Nye's obligations are as far as time. And we maybe can go a few minutes past 4:30 today, but that will be it. So,
I want to be candid with the court that while, you know, this is a witness who is moving expeditiously, I do not think I'm going to be done with this witness by 4:30. I just don't see that being the case, Your Honor.
okay, in that,
Right.
I didn't expect that you probably would be, and obviously we have cross-examination. I was just concerned about what the doctor's schedule was more than anything. So I wanted to let you know we weren't going to be able to go late today. So,
Understood.
okay, you may continue.
I think the question that I posed that led to this break was whether, Dr. Nye, you had an understanding of the relative weights and heights of Ms. Mullis and Mr. Mullis. And I think you provided an answer, but just because that was a few minutes ago, what is your understanding of their relative heights and weights?
My understanding is Ms. Mullis was 163-ish pounds near the time of the incident, about 5'1½", and Mr. Mullis is about 10.5 inches taller.
There was height and weight for Ms. Mullis. There was information in her medical records and in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, is that right?
Yes,
Were those numbers different in terms of her height or weight?
they are consistent.
All right. And the information in her medical records reflected her weight when she was, her weight and her height when she was alive?
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And I think you started to talk about this, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page since we took a break. It was your determination that it was not possible for the hypothesis that the corn rake in this case was swung into Ms. Mullis's body to be true. Is that right?
Yes, based on my investigation, that was, the corn rake was not swung into her body.
And how did you reach that determination?
So again, applying the engineering fundamentals, looking at the wound pattern, externally and internally, looking at the intrinsic properties and geometry and measurements of the rake, putting them together, understanding that we know that A, B, and C wounds happen first, and their wound trajectories are about horizontal with the long axis of the body. So you match.
Let me stop you right there. What does horizontal to the long axis of the body mean?
Like perpendicular. So perpendicular, near perpendicular to the long axis of the body. That's the wound paths for A, B, C, and D. So if you match up the tines, which have a very fixed position and geometry, now I have a relative position of the rake handle has to be essentially along the long axis of her body. The rake handle is along her body. Essentially, like her buttocks would be contacting the handle upon entry for A, B, and C to occur. So then, understanding that, you look at the swing options. Aside from the multiple swing option, let's look at the first swing option. And a swinging of the rake, overhead swinging of the rake, would generate much steeper angles of wound trajectory and did not match the physical evidence.
I want to show you I'm going to show you a demonstrative that we've identified as figure E. Let me just tell the state what this is. This is looking at some demonstrative exhibits assist you in your testimony in describing how you considered the hypothesis of whether Mr. Mullis swung this rake into Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes, how I can demonstrate how I analyzed it, yes.
Okay. You're looking at I think there should be a figure on the screen in front of you, which is we've identified as figure E. Would using figure E help you illustrate your testimony?
Yes.
All right, and can you explain how you determined that swinging an overhead swing would not have, is not a hypothesis that works in terms of how Ms. Mullis received these injuries?
Yes, so what this entails is the figure that demonstrates the wound trajectories for all A to F wounds, and that A, B, C, and D are essentially, like we talked about, perpendicular to the long axis of the body. In an overhead swing, based on the properties of the rake, when you try to swing it into a person, you're creating much steeper angles. So therefore, the type and direction of forces.
Hey, good night, Michelle. Good night, good night. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Have a good night. We'll be over with soon here. So, okay. Let's finish this on out.
That are necessary to cause Ms. Mullis's diagnosed wound pattern isn't generated from the swing.
So there are different angles at which, depending on the distance of two people, in terms of where they're standing vis-a-vis each other, there's different angles that could be generated by an overhead swing depending on the distance between the two people. Is that right?
So if you want to generate the maximum speed, you mean, then you have to be farther apart?
Well, my question is just that if, for instance, if in this situation, in this scenario where you're assuming people of the relative heights of Ms. Mullis and Mr. Mullis, if you're considering a hypothesis of whether someone standing behind Ms. Mullis and swinging the rake overhead, how that would contact Ms. Mullis's back.
Yes.
Depending on the distance between the two people, that angle might be different. Is that right? The angle at which the rake hit Ms. Mullis's back.
So you want the rake tines to hit. So that you're not talking about the other parts of the rake.
Let me ask you a better question.
Okay.
Would the distance between two people in a hypothetical where a person is standing and then a person is standing behind them swinging a rake overhead, would the distance between the two people impact the angle at which the rake tines hit their back?
Well, if you have them closer, the rake tines might not even hit their back at all.
And why is that?
Because of the, again, intrinsic properties of the rake. It has a specific length, it has a specific entry point if you want the tines to be in there. So they have to be positioned and oriented in such a way that the rake tines enter her body while she's hyperextended.
And is there, but could you envision in testing this hypothesis any sort of position where a person could have been standing behind Ms. Mullis and swinging the rake overhead where the specific injuries with the specific pattern and trajectory that Ms. Mullis's injuries had could have resulted?
No. We tested standing upright, various angles of bending over, lying flat on the ground. The way the rake tine is built and her nature of her injuries, and knowing that she has to be hyperextended at the time the tines enter to cause A, B, and C, the angles don't match. The position and orientation doesn't match. Therefore, the mechanisms, the type and direction of forces necessary to cause those specific diagnosed wounds don't match.
I'm going to show you figure F. Let me have you take the demonstrative away and let me ask you a different question. I mean, you've talked about the rake being, the hypothetical that the rake was swung overhead. There's other ways that a rake could be swung into a person's back, is that right?
Yes.
I mean, another way would be through more of a baseball swing?
Yes, a
swung
lateral
sideways?
swing. Yes, a sideways swing.
A lateral swing. Did you consider that hypothesis as well?
Yes.
And could you prove or disprove that hypothesis?
Yes.
Which did you do?
Disproved it.
And why is that?
Again, based on the intrinsic properties of the rake and the injury pattern. If you're going to swing it sideways into the body, you would have a more vertical oriented wound pattern. That's in line. That's not what she has. Additionally, the wound paths through her body wouldn't match. So again, the mechanism of injury necessary to cause her diagnosed wound paths aren't generated with a lateral swing.
You talked earlier about your understanding in this case based on the medical diagnoses that Ms. Mullis's back would have been hyperextended at the time that she experienced these wounds.
So biomechanically, that is true as well.
Right, and would the fact that her back was hyperextended, and to hyperextend her back, that her arm, at least her right arm, would have had to have been back, did that impact your analysis as to whether any kind of swinging could have caused these injuries?
I mean, the arm could get in the way, again, as well. So if you're talking about position and orientation, in order to get that A wound, which is on the side of the chest, you know, with your arm, if you're trying to swing it, the arm is in the way, essentially.
What about a hypothetical where instead of, in a hypothetical, somebody of Mr. Mullis's size standing behind Ms. Mullis, they're facing each other at the time in this hypothetical that the rake is swung? Did you consider that hypothetical?
Yes,
And what was your conclusion about the possibility of that hypothetical?
it was that hypothesis is disproven.
And why is that?
Because again, of the wound paths and the rake, if you swing overhead, you're going to have upward trajectories. And then we already know that ENF can't be generated first because it's essentially in the middle of their back. You can't have two tines entering in the middle of her back without a third tine contacting. And we only have two wounds that are upward trajectories.
If someone had swung the rake into Ms. Mullis into wounds E and F, would there have to be other wounds in that same trajectory?
You'd have again, a third tine sometime would have to contact it because of the location of the wounds and the spacing between the tines.
So I think we've shown you, well, I want to ask you this. I mean, is it possible for somebody to have swung the rake into any of these wounds, wounds A through F, and had one tine make contact with her body and all of the other tines missing her body?
So again, we talked about how the wounds are essentially in the middle of her back. The nature and diagnosis of her wounds and the intrinsic properties of the rake, you cannot insert one tine at a time.
Does the condition of Ms. Mullis's coat that she was wearing at the time she came to the hospital, does that factor into your opinion that the rake could not have been swung into Ms. Mullis?
It supports it.
How's that?
Well, again, she has 6 holes in her body and there's 4 tines in the rake and there's less holes in the coat than there are in the body. So if you swing it, even though we've proven that the trajectory doesn't match with any kind of swinging that we've talked about, if you take that rake out and re-swing it, you still have less holes in the coat than you do in the body, so that doesn't matter. So that's, again, further support that a swinging incident did not cause these injuries.
Given your training and expertise in biomechanical engineering and the investigation that you conducted in this case, Dr. Nye, can you think of any position that Ms. Mullis and a hypothetical assailant of Mr. Mullis's height could be in vis-a-vis each other? Any position that they could be in relative to each other where, from an engineering perspective, it would be possible for someone to cause this wound pattern in Ms. Mullis's back from swinging this corn rake into her?
So I analyzed the information that's available. There's no, information that there's a trapeze available. I can't analyze every single 1,000,010, possibilities, but those are all unlikely. I have to take into consideration the evidence in the case. And engineering analyses, like we talked about, don't take 2 seconds to do, right? So my analyses are based on the information that's provided and the scenarios that are provided. But from my analysis of the case, given what I have, there was not an alternative scenario that fit the physical evidence and the science.
Did you consider the hypothesis that someone pushed Ms. Mullis down on the rake?
Yes.
And did you determine whether or not that hypothesis was possible?
I considered it, but I considered it.
And could you prove or disprove that hypothesis in your consideration?
I disproved it.
And why is that?
So when you push someone, you are imparting horizontal velocity as well as rotational acceleration to their body. So when you push someone, they're going to essentially rotate, kind of flip. And if this rake we talked about is top heavy. So if you're falling on the rake with horizontal and rotational acceleration of your body with your upper body and you hit the rake tips, you're going to flip this rake. And if you flip the rake, then you don't have the rake tines pointing up in the manner to cause the injuries.
And when you talk about it generating horizontal force, if someone is standing in front of me and shoves me, hypothetically, you know, 2 hands into my 2 shoulders, that horizontal force, where is that going to send my body?
It's going to send you backwards and rotate because a person standing upright, their center of mass is about 55% of their standing height, so about navel. So we're already slightly top heavy, generally speaking. So now if you push someone above their center of mass, now you're going to move them backwards and rotate them. So basically going to flip them with their feet coming up, in a sense.
Your Honor, I think I probably have maybe another 20, 25 minutes. I think this might be a good time to stop for the day, and we will endeavor tomorrow to finish promptly.
No, that's fine. Thank you for letting me know this is a good time for a break. We'll go ahead and recess for the night. Counsel, maybe if you just check in with me back in chambers before you take off. I'll plan on seeing everyone back tomorrow. Thank you.
Then they are done for the day. I bet that doctor's like, daggone it, let him just take another 25 minutes. Let me get through this so I don't have to come back tomorrow. Rawr, rawr, rawr. I would be. I'd be like, no, let's finish. I just spit on you guys. I'm so sorry. Let's finish this. All right. Well, I mean, I find it interesting what they're saying about the jacket. The Carhartt jacket. That there's more holes in her back than what's in the jacket. So if he swung and hit her and you got the 3, 4 holes and then you pull it back out and you swing it again, then you're probably going to have more like 10 or 12 holes in the jacket, wouldn't you think? I don't know. I don't know. And from what she kind of said was that, you know, if she, the first one that was on there today, had said something like, I don't know. Can't remember exactly what it was that she said. Hey, LaTanya, maybe the jacket flung up. Maybe, but they're heavy. Those Carhartt jackets are heavy. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Very weird. Right, LaTanya, very weird. It would be helpful. That's exactly what I said, Kayleen. We need Mythbusters to do a reenactment. That's exactly what I said early today. Word for word. I even said Mythbusters. We need them to come and do a reenactment. Yes, we do. But I'm going to get out of here. It's 5:33. Going to go get some supper, figure out some other stuff. So, but thank you guys for hanging out with me today. It's been a lot of fun. Way more information that's kind of got me thinking, you know, more about this than yesterday for sure, right? I'm eager to see who else they plan to put up on the stand. So, join me back tomorrow. I would assume about the same time. The judge didn't actually give a time, well, just now, you know. So I would assume about the same time. But I'll be on and see you guys tomorrow. Have a great night, everyone. And if it's warming up where you're at, go stick your head outside. Enjoy a little bit of that less frigid weather. Brr. All right. Yes, Morgana, feel better, ma'am. Get you some potato cakes. Get your belly slightly full, not too full, but slightly full. And get you a good night's rest tonight. All right. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Love you all. Make sure to hit the thumbs up before you leave. Subscribe if you're new. Hit that notification bell and hashtag replay in the comments down below if you're watching this on a replay. All right? Love you guys. Bye. Ma'am, I am not coming to clean up no throw up, Morgana. I just about hit the end stream button. Tell Mama nope. Nope, nope, nope. Love you.